Since the beginning of time, humanity has looked for a pick me up, something to boost the energy when work's running late or when you want to get a little extra pumped. And we found an answer: stimulants. Whether you're consuming a cup of joe on your morning commute or chowing down on coca leaves in the Andes, you are taking part in the human tradition of artificially boosting your mood. In this video, we are going to explore four of the most common stimulants: caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, and methamphetamine. We are going to focus on their method of action in the brain and the cultural impacts of their use. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Caffeine is the most consumed drug in the world, consumed by billions daily. Some as a morning ritual, others as an afternoon pick-me-up. Consuming caffeine as coffee has been practiced since the 15th century. In the 15th century, it was predominantly consumed in Sufi monasteries as a way to continue chanting late into the night. Once it reached the Ottomans in the 16th century, it took on a new life. The Ottomans quickly built coffee houses in their bazaars. These coffee houses would become central in the public sphere of the Ottoman Empire, drawing crowds of exclusively men who would debate and sing. In the 17th century, coffee would enter European consciousness and would spawn a European version of the Ottoman coffee house. These coffee houses would have a lively atmosphere in which everyone from scholars, politicians, and political dissidents would debate and chat for hours. They earned the name penny universities because for a penny one would get a cup of joe and access to some of the greatest minds at the time. In some cases, revolutions were planned within the interior of these houses. So what's happening in the brain that allows coffee to enable everything from late night chanting to political revolution? It comes down to the receptor that it binds to, the andosine receptor. This receptor is responsible for regulating sleep-wake cycles. Caffeine is an example of an andosine receptor antagonist. This means it blocks other neurotransmitters from binding to the receptor when it is bound. When caffeine binds to the receptor, it produces a wakeful state. The downstream effects of this binding are a release of dopamine, which leads to a mild buzz, causes an upregulation of the stress and panic region of the brain, leading to a sense of alertness, increased heart rate and blood pressure, and it can lead to an increase in serotonin. It is clear from caffeine's method of action that it would lend itself to lively debate, late night prayers, or just a boost at the gym. Nicotine is a capitalist dream, a substance that hooks the user with an interesting buzz but leaves them stuck with a chronic addiction. This is all due to its mechanism of action in the brain. Nicotine binds to the nicotine acetylcholine receptors. When it binds, it causes a channel to open, allowing for the flow of sodium and calcium ions. The binding of the receptors in the ventral tegmental or midbrain causes a release of dopamine. This release of dopamine has a reinforcing effect on the brain's reward system. At some point, your brain needs this release of dopamine just to maintain normal levels of dopamine. This makes the drug perfect for capitalism as people become dependent and require a constant dose. One of the most common side effects from nicotine are head spins, which are a form of vertigo. Vertigo is caused by a mismatch of signals in the brain leading to the head spin effect. The mismatch from nicotine is caused by a variety of interactions in the brain. The main one is the binding to the receptors in the vestibular nuclei and cerebellum, which alters the rate of firing of these neurons and leads to confusion in the brain. The head spins are part of the capitalist trap. They slowly disappear as usage becomes more heavy, leaving the user without any perceivable buzz, but a dependence. So how did we get here? How did this substance become so widespread? Well, it starts with the conquering of the New World, when Spanish colonizers made contact with the Native Americans and they noticed a tradition: the smoking of tobacco out of pipes or rolled in leaves. The colonists quickly fell in love with this substance and began importing it into Europe. At first, the use of tobacco was limited to the upper class, but quickly spread to the lower class. The lower class began smoking shredded leftovers of the upper class cigars. They would wrap the shreds in paper, forming the earliest example of a cigarette. Cigarettes would spread quickly throughout Europe and West Asia, typically by soldiers sharing tobacco products on the front lines of wars. By the 20th century, everyone was doing it and the tobacco giants had established themselves. Then, in the mid-20th century, the negative health impacts of tobacco-based products were discovered. This would culminate in the 1964 paper, Smoking and Health, by the US government. Slowly over the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the amount of smokers would decline from 44% of the population at its height to 14% in 2017. In the early 2010s, a new class of tobacco-free nicotine products would appear, starting with the vape. The problem with this new class of nicotine products was the targeted advertisement towards children. Suddenly we had another epidemic on our hands of children and teens vaping. governments would respond with heavy restrictions that would limit their use by children. And that's nicotine, a capitalist wet dream of a substance. Please avoid, it's not worth it. Cocaine appears like a modern drug but has a millennia of history behind it. It first saw use in the Andes by the indigenous population, but not as the powder we conceive of today. They would chew coca leaves as a ritual stimulant, digestive aid, and for pain relief. Then, when Columbus and his cronies rocked up, they began systematically farming it as a source of stimulation for the native workforce. It wasn't until 3 centuries later that the cocaine molecule itself would be extracted by Albert Niemann, a German chemist. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, the drug would begin to see medical use as a local anesthetic. In 1930, cocaine would become heavily regulated through the United Nations International Opium Convention. Then, in the 1960s, with the rise of Hollywood and jazz culture, the drug would become a staple in the underground club scene. This would coincide with the steep increase in cocaine purity in the underground lab scene. In 1978, the first reported case of crack cocaine occurred in Philadelphia. Throughout the 80s, the extraction method changed from the classic bongo method to solvent-based extraction, further increasing the purity. This trend of increasing purity kept going until the 90s, where it reached its peak of 95 to 99% pure. But at the same time, the war on drugs began, leading to heavy crackdowns on cocaine and crack. Then in the 2010s, cocaine saw a resurgence. So how has this drug captured the mind of the club scene for nearly half a century? It comes down to its mechanism of action in the brain. Cocaine is an example of a monoamine reuptake inhibitor. This means it stops the brain from reclaiming monoamine neurotransmitters, flooding the synaptic cleft with these neurotransmitters. The monoamine class of neurotransmitters include dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. The monoamine that is most important for cocaine's mechanism of action is dopamine. Cocaine causes a surge of dopamine in the ventral tegmental, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. This creates a euphoria engine and feels highly rewarding. The outcome of this euphoria is increased confidence, heightened alertness, and decreased appetite. Cocaine is a staple of the club scene and has been for nearly half a century, with roots going back to the indigenous American population. Meth is the most powerful substance that is going to be spoken about here. It is so powerful because of its mechanism of action. Like cocaine, meth interacts with the monoamine neurotransmitters, but instead of inhibiting uptake, it instead drains the storage vestigials the brain uses to store the neurotransmitters. At the same time as flushing the brain of monoamines, it reverses the direction of the transport, force-feeding neurotransmitters onto the synaptic cleft. It also reduces the ability for the brain to degrade monoamine neurotransmitters, leaving them sitting there for a long period of time. The outcomes of this intense flushing of neurotransmitters are acutely euphoria, confidence, decreased appetite, increased concentration, and increased sexual arousal. Chronically, they are addiction, compulsive use, mood disorders, psychosis, cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, neurotoxicity, and the degradation of the blood-brain barrier. Unlike the previous 3 drugs, meth is a relatively new drug. So instead of focusing on history, we are going to focus on the socio-economic impacts of meth. Meth is a cheap drug, so its abuse disproportionately affects those in the lower socio-economic belt of society. The effects on the family unit is violence born out of addiction. The effects economically is a productivity loss leading to a higher unemployment rate. These 2 effects have put meth directly in the crosshairs of the war on drugs. This focus on meth as the enemy has seen 2 main outcomes: minimum sentencing for meth-related crimes and higher levels of policing in low-income neighborhoods. The question of how we overcome the so-called meth epidemic is a challenge to answer. The result of the war on drugs is that a stigma has been created, driving addicts into the darkest corners of our society. This leads to less help-seeking behavior and drives more risk-taking behavior. There must be a better solution. Stimulants are the ultimate answer to humanity's search for a pick-me-up. Some of them provide a small boost in mood, whereas others provide a larger boost. If you want to experiment with stimulants, I would recommend sticking to caffeine, as the other 3 options discussed here are incredibly addictive and will ruin your life.